Is Keir Starmer gay? Must be. Keir Starmer? Come on. I'd bet on it, wouldn't you? He seems gay, he looks gay, he dresses gay. I don't think actually it would be that way round, would it? Who'd be doing who? Wouldn't you love it? Let's decide, shall we? Keir Starmer is banging Phil Schofield. Allegedly.
Did you see the moment Keir Starmer lost control on live TV? It was a political showdown that left viewers stunned. Katie Hopkins, known for her sharp tongue, took on the Labour leader in a fierce debate that exposed cracks in Starmer's carefully crafted image. As accusations flew, Starmer struggled to defend himself, revealing a side of the politician rarely seen in public. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favour. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So, did you click the subscribe button? Great, thank you so much. Now, back to the video. Keir Starmer stepped into the TV studio, exuding an air of confidence. The Labour leader had reason to feel assured. Recent polls showed his party comfortably ahead of the Conservatives. His carefully cultivated image as a steady, competent alternative to Boris Johnson seemed to be paying off. As Starmer settled into the makeup chair, his team briefed him on potential topics. They'd prepared responses to questions about Labour's economic plans and Brexit strategy. Starmer nodded along, mentally rehearsing key talking points. He'd become adept at staying on message, rarely caught off guard in interviews. But beneath the polished exterior, undercurrents of discontent were brewing. Some Labour MPs privately grumbled about Starmer's cautious approach, arguing it lacked vision. And while the party led in the polls, Starmer's personal approval ratings lagged behind. A growing segment of voters saw him as bland and indecisive. Starmer seemed oblivious to these rumblings as he strode onto the set. He greeted the crew with practiced charm, making small talk about football. His team had drilled into him the importance of appearing relatable.
His sort of outlook is gay, staying in Lord Alley's apartment, a bit gay, being there for a month and a half, quite gay, probably gay, must be gay. I mean, can we at least start that as a rumour? Can you print that, Daily Mirror, can you? Katie Hopkins libels Keir Starmer as banging Phil Schofield. I get the impression Phil would be receiving. Possibly one shouldn't speculate too far.
As he took his seat, Starmer felt ready for a fairly routine interview. That sense of ease evaporated when Katie Hopkins entered the studio. Known for her provocative style and right-wing views, Hopkins had a knack for unsettling politicians. Her presence hadn't been mentioned in the pre-interview brief. Starmer's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. As the cameras began rolling, Starmer fell back on his legal training. He answered the first few questions with measured responses, careful not to commit to specifics. Hopkins listened intently, an unsettling smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. The interview's cordial tone didn't last long. Hopkins pounced on Starmer's vague answer about tax policy. "Let's cut through the politician speak," she interrupted. "Will you raise taxes on working families or not?" Hopkins' opening salvo caught Starmer off guard. "Betrayal of Britain," she declared, her words hanging in the air like a thunderclap. Starmer's practiced smile faltered for a moment before he regained his composure. "Now, Katie, that's quite an accusation," Starmer responded, his tone measured. "Labour has always put the British people first. Our policies are designed to lift up all communities, not just the privileged few." But Hopkins wasn't about to let him off the hook with vague platitudes. She pressed on, targeting Starmer's economic policies and their impact on retirees. "Let's talk about the elderly, shall we? Soaring energy bills, reduced access to healthcare, and a lack of social support. How do you explain that to pensioners struggling to make ends meet?" Starmer's discomfort began to show. He shifted in his seat, his rehearsed responses suddenly feeling inadequate. "We're committed to addressing these issues," he began, but Hopkins cut him off. "Commitment isn't enough when people are suffering now," she retorted. "Your shadow chancellor, Rachel Reeves, dismissed concerns about retirees, saying they wouldn't vote Labour anyway." Is that how you treat a whole generation of Britons? The accusation hung in the air, and Starmer's face betrayed a flicker of genuine panic. He hadn't been prepared for this level of specific damning evidence. The carefully constructed image of a leader in touch with the people was starting to crumble. Hopkins continued her onslaught, turning to Labour's broader economic policies. Your inheritance tax plans have been called a land grab by communists. Farmers and small business owners are terrified of losing everything they've built. How is that putting Britain first? Starmer attempted to defend the policy, but his words rang hollow in the face of Hopkins' relentless questioning. The studio atmosphere grew increasingly tense as it became clear that the Labour leader was struggling to provide satisfactory answers. As the interview progressed, Hopkins revealed more evidence of Labour's apparent disregard for working-class citizens. She cited rising living costs, unfulfilled promises, and a growing sense of disillusionment among voters who once formed Labour's core support base. Your party claims to represent the working class, but your policies tell a different story, Hopkins challenged. How do you explain the disconnect between Labour's promises and the reality faced by millions of Britons? Starmer's responses became increasingly defensive and evasive. His usual poise had abandoned him, replaced by visible discomfort and frustration. The interview had veered far from the controlled narrative he was accustomed to presenting. Starmer's carefully crafted image was about to face its toughest test yet. As Hopkins shifted gears to discuss Labour's tax policies, a question hung in the air. How many broken promises would it take for voters to lose faith completely? The answer would soon become painfully clear. Hopkins wasted no time in addressing the elephant in the room. Mr. Starmer, during your campaign, you and your deputy Angela Rayner made a clear promise: no tax increases for working families. Yet here we are, with taxes rising and families struggling. How do you explain this blatant contradiction? Starmer's face tightened as he attempted to justify Labour's changing stance. The economic landscape has shifted significantly since those statements were made. We've had to adapt our policies to address the current challenges facing the country. But Hopkins wasn't buying it. She pressed on, presenting evidence of Starmer's contradictory statements. You campaigned on a platform of change, yet your tax policies seem eerily similar to those of the Conservative Party. Voters are left wondering, what exactly does Labour stand for? The political implications of these broken campaign promises were significant. Trust, once lost, is hard to regain in politics. Starmer's credibility was on the line, and with it, the future of the Labour Party's relationship with its core voter base. Public reaction to Labour's tax policies had been swift and largely negative. Social media was ablaze with criticism, with many voters expressing feelings of betrayal and disillusionment. One tweet that had gone viral read, "Voted Labour for change, got more of the same. Thanks for nothing, Starmer." As Hopkins continued her relentless questioning, Starmer's composure began to visibly falter. Gone was the confident, articulate leader who had entered the studio earlier. In his place sat a man struggling to defend his party's decisions and maintain his political reputation. The tension in the studio reached a boiling point when Hopkins addressed Labour's inheritance tax policy. Your plans have been described as nothing short of a land grab by communists. Farmers and small business owners are terrified of losing everything they've worked for. How can you justify this attack on hard-working Britons? Starmer attempted to explain the nuances of the policy, but his words seemed to fall flat in the face of Hopkins's sharp critique. The Labour leader's carefully constructed facade was crumbling before the nation's eyes. As the interview reached its climax, it was clear that Starmer had been caught off guard by the intensity and specificity of Hopkins' questioning. The political landscape had shifted beneath his feet, and he was struggling to find solid ground. The confrontation between Hopkins and Starmer had exposed deep-seated issues within the Labour Party and raised serious questions about its direction. As viewers watched in stunned silence, one thing became clear: this interview would have far-reaching consequences for British politics. Just when Starmer thought he'd weathered the worst of Hopkins' onslaught, she revealed a trump card that would leave him speechless. How many British citizens does it take to shake the foundations of a political party? The number Hopkins was about to drop would stun both Starmer and viewers alike. Mr. Starmer, are you aware of the petition demanding a general election? Hopkins asked, her tone deceptively casual. Starmer, visibly relieved at what seemed like a softball question, allowed himself a small smile. Yes, I've heard of it. These online petitions pop up all the time. They're hardly representative of the broader public opinion. Starmer responded dismissively. Hopkins' eyes gleamed. Representative, you say? This petition has gathered over 1.9 million signatures. That's 1.9 million British citizens calling for your party to face the voters. How do you explain that level of public discontent? Starmer's face fell as the magnitude of the number sank in. He stammered, struggling to form a coherent response. Well, that is, we must consider the context. But Hopkins wasn't finished. She pressed on, highlighting how the petition represented a groundswell of public frustration. These aren't just numbers, Mr. Starmer. These are voters who feel betrayed by your leadership. They're demanding transformative change in governance, not the status quo you seem to represent. The Labour leader's discomfort was palpable. He shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence evaporating under the heat of Hopkins' relentless questioning. As he fumbled for words, it became clear that Starmer had grossly underestimated the public's dissatisfaction with his party's performance. Hopkins seized on his hesitation. Your silence speaks volumes, Mr. Starmer. This petition's momentum has been largely ignored by mainstream media. Some argue it's a deliberate attempt to shield you from scrutiny. What do you say to that? Starmer's response was weak and evasive. We take all public feedback seriously, but we must also consider the broader picture. Political analysts watching the interview were quick to point out the potential impact of this confrontation on Labour's strategy. One expert noted, this petition could have significant legal and political implications. It reflects a growing demand for accountability that Labour can't afford to ignore. As the interview drew to a close, it was clear that Starmer had been dealt a devastating blow. His lack of a clear, convincing answer to the petition question served as the final nail in the coffin of his credibility. The carefully constructed image of a leader in touch with the people lay in tatters. Hopkins' parting shot drove home the gravity of the situation. Mr. Starmer, this petition is more than just numbers on a screen. It represents the deep frustrations felt by many across the UK. Retirees, working-class families, people who once saw Labour as their champion. They feel abandoned by your policies. How do you intend to regain their trust? Starmer's response was lost in a sea of ums and ahs. As the cameras stopped rolling, he sat back in his chair, visibly shaken. The interview had exposed not just his personal failings as a leader, but the growing disconnect between the Labour Party and its traditional voter base. The question now hanging in the air was clear. Could Starmer and Labour recover from this public evisceration, or was this the beginning of the end for their political ambitions?